Hello, everyone. This is Keith Stone, your host for the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series. We're very happy to welcome as our guest today, Dr. G Xanthou, who has been our frequent guest in the past. And by way of brief introduction, I will say that she is a research associate in Pandaric Studies at Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, which is our sponsoring institution. She also teaches the history of Greek civilization and culture at the Hellenic Open University, and she's a senior research associate at the University of Bristol. In terms of current projects, she is completing a commentary on Pindar's Epinetian Odes to be published by the Center for Hellenic Studies. For a full and impressive list of her awards and past positions, I refer you to the online announcement for this event. The title for today's conversation is Metus, Hostilis, and Fear Appeals in 4th Century BCE Rhetoric. Maria, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me, Keith. And my thank you is extended to all the members of our community.
Thank you. And before I let you begin, I'd like to ask you, perhaps again, because you've been such a frequent guest, but could you tell us about the beginnings of your interest in things classical?
My answer to this question is that reading is the key. That led me to classics. Reading, first of all, Greek mythology, even since elementary school, hearing other people talking about Greek mythology, especially the Odyssey, and also traveling around Greece with my family is what really prompted me to study classics. And of course later in school, when I first began looking more closer to the Greek language and Latin language, this really now helped me decide that this is what I would like to do, like pursue the study of classics. So there are many reasons that led me to this path.
Thank you. All right, take it away.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to present you today is the continuation of a project that I started as a fellow at the Harvard Center of Hellenic Studies. It's a project about fear, the use of goodwill in Isocrates. And I would like to show you on the second slide what I mean about this. When I began studying Isocrates' theory Goodwill as a precursor of emotional intelligence, in order to understand and develop this Isocratean concept, I had to look into the emotion, the notion and the concept of fear. So I started looking more about how fear is constructed as an emotion. My next step was prompted by a book that features on, its title features on this slide, is by Ioannis Evrigenis. It's Fear of Enemies and Collective Action. The author studies exactly how fear is used in political discourse, and this in a way prompted me to look what I'm going to present you today about how fear is used in Greek rhetoric, especially in 4th century rhetoric. And I examined the most prominent examples, Demosthenes and Isocrates. So what I'm going to do is to offer you an overview about fear, what Aristotle is telling us, how Aristotle interprets fear. Then we are going to use closely on fear appeals, and then I'm going to present you how Isocrates responds to this fear theory by offering his eunoia program. So Fear, usually we say that life begins at the end of our comfort zone. And where our comfort zone ends, fear, the most controversial and creative of human emotions, takes over. Modern cultural theories regard fear as a necessary condition for humanity and crucial to all forms of human agency, because it is considered the conveyor of creative destruction. This means that it involves the apparently contradictory connotations of preserving and changing, and this contradictory interplay results to eventual advancement either in the forms of moving along or of breakthrough. Now, personal fear keeps us on alert. It makes us apprehensive, where collective fear unites us and sometimes also divides us. Its dissuasive, divisive, and connective nature is par excellence manifested in politics, where it prompts group formation and promotes collective action. And politics, we all know, is fueled by fear. Above all, since connectivity through fear results into collectivity, political fear is by and large collective fear, usually defined as, I quote, a people's felt apprehension of some harm to their collective well-being. Aristotle, this is number 1 in your handout, in his rhetoric defines, and I quote, fear, phobos is the Greek word, as a painful or troubled feeling. The painful feeling is lype and the troubled feeling is tarache, caused by the impression of an imminent evil that causes destruction or pain. For according to Aristotle, men do not fear or evils, but only those which involve great pain or destruction, and only if they appear to be far off, but near at hand and threatening, for men do not fear things that are very remote, unquote. Thus, Aristotle links fear as a human feeling to the idea of being at risk. And this risk involves harms that are prospective and near, so they may affect us directly. Therefore, he links fear with personal, familiar, imminent, and direct threat, and other interrelated concepts such as danger, vulnerability, and violence, which imply the different stimuli people react to and the various contexts of their reaction. This notion of personal, familiar, imminent, and prospective fear is so hardwired in this concept that it is difficult for each one to be considered separately. In many ways, risk represents the possibility of trouble or injury, or something unpleasant or unwelcome that may happen. It also implies a situation involving exposure to danger. Fear and anxiety arise because of perceived risks. So in the same treatise, the Rhetoric, Aristotle considers fear appeals in rhetoric necessary because orators instill in their audience the belief that similar misfortunes may fall upon themselves and thus make them fear that possibility. In that sense, he models risk probability and fear management together in order to address fear not only as a self-regarding concept, but also as an emotion. Hence, he makes clear that fear may be used for the benefit of community, of state preservation through collective perception and deliberation. In that sense, Aristotle expands the semantic range of fear from personal to collective level. According to Aristotle, and I quote, fear makes people inclined to deliberation. This is number 2 in your handout. And I quote, those experiencing and thinking they experience great good fortune do not think they might suffer. Therefore, they are insolent and belittlers and rush, wealth, strength, and abundance of friends makes them so. Nor are those afraid who think they have already suffered all dreadful things possible and have become coldly indifferent to the future, like those actually being done to death. For fear to continue, there must be some hope of being saved from the cause of the agony. And there is a sign of this. Fear makes people inclined to deliberation, while no one deliberates about hopeless things. The result is that whenever it is better for a speaker's case that the members of the audience experience fear, he should make them realize that they are liable to suffering. This Aristotelian passage resonates, in effect, as a good illustration of the Thucydidean persona of Pericles' statement we all know, and it features in handout number 3. And I quote, "We Athenians, in our persons, take our decisions on policy and submit them to proper discussion. The worst thing is to rush into action before consequences being properly debated. And this is another point where we differ from other people. We are capable at the same time of taking risks and assessing them beforehand. Others are brave out of ignorance, and when they stop to think, they begin to fear. But the man who can most truly be accounted brave is he who best knows the meaning of what is sweet in life and what is terrible, and he then goes out undeterred to meet what is to come." Now, I would like at this point to add a very useful disclaimer, which was pointed out by John Hesk, about the importance of fear. And I think it illustrates Pericles' statement. And I quote, "If a political speech or argument makes us anxious or afraid, it isn't necessarily designed to make us abandon our powers of logic or evidence-based reasoning. Rather, it is a way of grabbing our attention and ensuring that we use those powers to assess and deliberate upon the risks, vulnerabilities, and liabilities to ourselves which it raises and claims." Unquote. As I have implied earlier, masses, civic bodies, and individuals are all motivated by fear. We are all motivated by fear. The understanding and management of political or civic fear may result into an equilibrium of tensions, the hotbed of which lies in risk, danger, uncertainty, contingency, and precariousness. Since the stimuli of fear are these, fear requires control or management in order to be effective. In order to achieve this equilibrium of tensions, fear needs to be harnessed, at times carefully controlled, if not wisely manipulated. As, and I quote, "Too much fear is paralyzing, but too little fear may prove deadly." The right amount of fear enables people to sense and assess danger and ultimately take measures to thwart it. For example, Athenians tried to overcome their anxiety over the takeover and use of political fear in the public and civic sphere through regular practice of successfully convincing deliberative speech. What I'm about to present you are examples from Demosthenes' Philippics and Isocrates' oration to Philip, in order to make us understand how both orators use their fear appeals in order to appease the fear of the citizens of Athens. So how does an orator employ fear for deliberative purposes so as to persuade his audience? First, let me remind you that Demosthenes' Philippics and Olynthians, these two different sets of deliberative orations, illustrate most eloquently the ad hoc management of fear and the practical use of fear appeals. Over the course of these two sets of deliberative orations, Demosthenes aims at convincing the Athenians to take necessary action, as we all know, against Philip, who poses a direct threat to the city of Athens. Therefore, in order to do so, Demosthenes seeks to create an equal balance of both civic fear and courage among his audience. At another level, Philippics and Olympics exemplify his experiment to find a proper mixture between emotion appeals, and fear appeals in particular, and judgment. However, both sets, which were delivered between 351 and 341 BCE, though uneven, demonstrate a gradual progress towards finding the proper balance between management of arguments and modulation of emotions. Only in the third Philippic, Demosthenes succeeds in finding this much wanted balance between emotion and judgment. Hence, this speech stands out in terms of rhetorical technique and virtuosity, in terms of managing fear appeals. So I would like to single this particular oration out and focus on it. In the speech, Demosthenes follows the Aristotelian definition of fear, and he underscores the proximity of fear, namely Philip, in number 4 of your handout, and I quote, "For that, Philip, like the recurrence or attack of fever or some other disease, is threatening even those who think themselves out of reach, of that none of you are ignorant." In this passage, Demosthenes not only emphasizes the proximity of the object of fear, but also tags those orators who tend to flatter the Athenians, as well as a larger Pan-Hellenic audience, and aim at inspiring confidence by systematically aggrandizing Athens as Philip's agents. At the very outset of Third Philippic, he has already pointed out the significance of flattery. For example, according to Demosthenes, vacuous, self-defeating pretentiousness in the assembly, aided by populist rhetoric, simply encourages the retreat into make-believe. Hence, the confident speeches of these orators are identified as a part of a cunning and regular plan already used by Philip in previous conquests. In that sense, Demosthenes stresses the potential deliberative value of fear as he presents Philip regularly seeking to undermine the strength of his opponents by diffusing their fear and thus curbing their collective deliberative capacity, one of their important means to assess danger. This is number 5 of your handout, and I quote, "Perhaps you wonder why the people of Olynthus and Eretria and Oros were more favorably inclined to Philip's advocates than their own. The explanation is the same as at Athens, that the patriots, however much they desire it, cannot sometimes say anything agreeable, for they are obliged to consider the safety of the state. But the others, by their very effort to be agreeable, are playing into Philip's hands. It is the same tale everywhere. One party speaking to please their audience, the other giving advice that would have ensured their safety." Unquote. According to Demosthenes, the fate of the citizens who were averted from exercising their capacity due to inner subversive overconfidence created by populist rhetoric was sealed. This means that being already subverted from within, they were conquered from an enemy outside. In the case of 4th century Athenians, Ernst Badian argued that recollections of 5th century empire rekindled dreams of great power status. And it is exactly the same concept that Isocrates plays with, and we're going to see that in a few moments. Now, this collective imaginary of the glorious past made the Athenians prone to accept populist rhetoric and more ready to be convinced to vote for grandiose action followed by lack of implementation. A juxtaposition between Demosthenes and Isocrates' fear appeals gives us insight of this powerful means of persuasion. Isocrates stands on the opposite side of the spectrum by offering us a different example of how civic or collective fear is used in rhetorical discourse outside imminent deliberative purposes. I would like to begin with to Philip 75, this is handout number 6, which can be juxtaposed to the previous passage. This is the third Philippic. By speaking this rubbish, by pretending to have exact knowledge, and by speedily effecting in words the overthrow of the whole world, they are convincing many people. They convince most of all those who hunger for the same calamities as do the speechmakers. Next, those who exercise no judgment about their common welfare, but utterly obtuse in their own perceptions, are very grateful to men who pretend to feel alarm and fear in their behalf. And lastly, those who do not deny that you appear to be plotting against the Hellenes, but are of this opinion that the purpose with which you are charged is a worthy ambition. Now, throughout this speech, Isocrates draws a favorable image of Philip's ethos from the perspective of an elite Athenian. In this way, he presents the Macedonian king as a philosopher in training whose political ideas are affiliated to Isocrates' own way of thinking. The passage belongs to the central section of the speech, focusing on the parallel political situations of Isocrates and Philip and examining the anti-Philippic views of the Athenian politicians. Isocrates accuses Philip's detractors in Athens of focusing on particular Macedonian policies towards particular cities instead of looking at the larger picture. Detractors support their arguments by enumerating Philip's interventions, such as his rescue of the Messenians, his involvement in the Third Sacred War, his relation with the Thessalians, Thebans, the Amphictyoni, the Argives, Messenians, and Lacedaemonians, without offering any context or perspective. This list of Philip's interventions, which I mentioned earlier, particularizes the Greek world, or it presents an image of a fragmented Greek world and focuses on its fragmentation in a way contrary to Isocrates' Pan-Hellenic view. If we examine closely this passage, we realize that Demosthenes' third Philippic seems a reaction to Isocrates' views as stated here. Isocrates deprecates the public orator's manipulated use of excessive fear, whereas Demosthenes accuses some orators of creating overconfidence. Isocrates accuses them of raising a false alarm and acting as fearmongers. Now, this discrepancy between Isocrates and Demosthenes leads us to the next question, which is how orators coordinate fear appeals with the values and commitments of the various social groups within a civic body or within a city. In order for a fear appeal to be convincing, the orators had to coordinate it with the values, the commitments, and the constraints of different political and social groups, which constitute what we may call the civic body. For example, the third Philippic provides a very good illustration as Demosthenes addresses another group of Athenian citizens, those who feel an excess of fear. According to Aristotle, the objects of civic fear are those contingencies that are conceivably addressed by political action, for citizens deliberate only about things within their power. However, overpowering fears serve the opposite purpose, thus inspiring flight, resignation, and political inertia. Demosthenes' speech recognizes the attitude of those Athenians who suffered from overpowering fear. This is number 7 in your handout, and I quote, "They seem to watch him just as they would watch a hailstorm, each praying that it may not come their way, but none making any effort to stay its course." Of course, he is talking about Philip, as we all realize. Demosthenes modifies this overwhelming state of fear into a civic type that encourages deliberation by putting the threat posed by Philip into perspective and thus presenting it as contingent rather than imminent and necessary. Hence, he points out that the Athenians, along with other Greeks, are capable of checking Philip's advances. As a result, he turns Philip into an appropriate object of deliberation. He resorts to the use of historical example to show the capacity of a united and virtuous Greek front, uncorrupted by bribery, to withstand the great threats of the barbarian world. And this is handout number 8. And I quote, "For not without reason, not without just cause, the Greeks of old were as eager for freedom as their descendants today are for slavery. There was something, men of Athens, something which animated the mass of the Greeks, but which is lacking now, something which triumphed over the wealth of Persia, which upheld the liberties of Hellas, which never lost a single battle by sea or land, something the decay of which has ruined everything and brought our affairs to a state of chaos." And what was that? It was nothing recondite or subtle or simple that men who took bribes from those who wished to rule Greece or ruin her were hated by all, and it was the greatest calamity to be convicted of receiving a bribe, and such a man was punished with the utmost severity, and no intercession, no pardon was allowed. Unquote. Isocrates also employs this pattern of excessive fear in Archidamus, and I think Sarah will help us see the PPT. Now, I quote, "It is a simple matter to reach a wise decision on this question. For if we are willing to die for our just rights, not only shall we gain renown, but in time to come, we shall be able to live securely. But if we show that we are afraid of danger, we shall plunge ourselves into endless confusion." I think that this particular passage dovetails very successfully with Demosthenes' concluding paragraph of the third Philippic. This is handout number 11, to which I shall come back later, as it invites the citizens of Athens to individually exercise their critical acumen, to assess contingent events, and to practically exhibit their courage to make such contingencies objects of deliberation and subsequent action. In his speech, Demosthenes addressed his audience to make clear that his appeal to fear forms an integral part of the process by which he prompts the civic body to apprehend, to assess, and to respond to the flow of contingent events that threatened the existence of their democratic value. The relation between fear and deliberative foresight is made explicit right from the outset of the third Philippic. This is handout number 10, and I quote, "I wish to tell you the grounds for my alarm about our condition, so that if my reasoning is sound, you may adopt it as your own and take forethought for yourselves." Here, peroration, however, this is handout number 11, provides with the best example of the balance that Demosthenes strikes between civic fear and courage and their importance for deliberation in civic democratic discourse. And again, quote, "It is folly and cowardice to cherish such hopes, to follow counsel, and refuse to perform any fraction of your duties, to lend an ear to the advocates of the enemies, and imagine that your city is so great that no conceivable danger can befall it. Many things could be named by the Olynthians today, which could have saved them from destruction if only they had foreseen them." So according to Demosthenes, false confidence inspired by conceited orators and wishful thinking motivated by excessive fear doomed the Olynthians, for both overconfidence and excessive fear had obstructed their capacity to foresee, to recognize potential contingencies, thus leading to deliberation. They were neither prepared by a civic fear to deliberate, nor sufficiently courageous to confront their fear. As a result, they were unable to thwart and survive the threat posed by Philip. Demosthenes concludes the third Philippic by expressing a personal fear. The citizens of Athens should exercise individually their good sense to confront contingent events, however fearful they may be, and their courage to make such contingencies object of deliberation and subsequent action. The Athenians should ultimately contemplate and take responsibility of their own civic emotions. This is number 12 in your handout, and I quote, "But if every man sits idle, consulting his own pleasure and careful to avoid his own duty, not only will he find no one to do it for him, but I fear that those duties that we wish to shirk may all be forced upon us at once. Otherwise, Philip's threat will impose its own agenda on the two constituencies, those excessively confident and those excessively fearful, and expedite their reaction, thus curtailing the possibilities for a successful outcome." In this particular passage, Demosthenes uses his personal fear as a veiled warning against this course of action. At this point now, since I have discussed or I gave you an idea of different examples of fear appeals, I would like to present you with what I call Isocrates' Eunoia program. So I would like to show you how Isocrates replaced fear with goodwill in his famous speech on the peace. In his speech on the peace, Isocrates offers his version of how Metus hostili, fear and fear appeals, may be replaced by goodwill as a political instrument so that the Athenians may benefit through improvement of interstate relations. Maltreatment of allies must be replaced with generosity, and the goodwill of the Greeks must be cultivated with pan-Hellenic leadership as a reward. In certain Isocratic passages, eunoia, goodwill, features as the emotional antonym of hatred resulting from fear. The antinomy between eunoia, goodwill, and hatred entails an inherently incompatible binary relationship which follows a certain pattern. This pattern includes, on the one hand, the practical manifestation of eunoia, as the Greeks willingly handing over the hegemony to Athens when the Confederacy of Delos is formed in 478 BCE, as a token of acknowledgement of Athenian valor during the Persian Wars. On the other hand, fear incurred due to the insolence of the leading city, and more importantly, due to the injustices against its allies, which were practiced during the city's hegemony, gradually eclipses eunoia, the Greeks' goodwill, leading to its utter distinction. The same pattern is evident in Isocrates' reasoning for Athens' eventual downfall as the outcome of unjust conduct, as well as Sparta's decline at the end of her hegemony, marked by the peace of Andalkidas in 387 BCE, while it is also aligned with the pattern proposed by Thucydides himself in his histories. The fall is explained by the fact that the allies' goodwill, the Greek allies' goodwill, is soon replaced by hatred, by misos. Hence, the emotion of hatred is used interchangeably for explaining the downfall of Athens and Sparta. So, in a way, this pattern works for both cities. The lack of goodwill is presented as the ultimate reason for the allies' dissatisfaction, fear, and of course hatred, because it is fear which fuels this hatred. So it's almost like a vicious circle. The fear is created through allies' dissatisfaction and leads ultimately to hatred. So this emotional descent from goodwill to dissatisfaction then to fear, and ultimately to hatred, intensifies gradually and reaches its lowest point, with goodwill vanishing as one or other of the two cities seizes the hegemony, in other words, the power over the majority of Greek cities. In On the Peace, Isocrates uses a mixed technique as regards the arousal of emotions and the assessment of fear. His explicit calls for an audience's emotional response in the particular speech are rare. He relies more on showing the audience that certain situations exist so that this emotion will arise naturally. Instead, he more often uses lexical instances of emotions which denote hatred, especially in the case of Athens' naval supremacy during the First Confederation, and casts them in the context of historical example, thus triggering memories based on personal and cultural experience. As a result, his calls for emotion response are built up to or subsequently explained, or at the very least arise naturally from narrated circumstances. Now, the combination of historical examples and emotions falls into the latter case, that of what we may call narrated circumstances. Now, since this sort of covert emotion arousal is the kind most intimately bound with the value systems of the audience that we discussed earlier, and hence the cultural construction of such emotions, it is worth exploring how Isocrates forms and applies this mixed technique. And I give you an example from Antidoses 121-122, where eunoia, or goodwill, as a cornerstone for the formation of interstate relations, features prominently as part of Isocrates' praise for the policies of the general Timotheus. The recognition of the importance of eunoia enabled Timotheus to be successful in enhancing Athenian power and prestige. However, goodwill cannot be created single-handedly. For example, in handout number 13, Isocrates establishes a causal relation between emotions and the creation of goodwill. And I quote, "But the facts which I now give entitle him to even greater praise. For although he saw that you respected only the kind of generals who threatened and tried to terrify the other cities, and were always for setting up some revolution or other among your allies, he, Timotheus, did not fall in within your prejudices, nor was he willing to enhance his own reputation for the injury of Athens. On the contrary, he made it the object of his thought and of his actions to see to it that no one of the cities of Hellas should be afraid of him, but that all should feel secure, excepting those which did wrong." In this passage, Isocrates outlines a negative framework of interstate relations based on fear. This emotion affects the state suffering abuse. The verbal manifestation of abuse is terror and threat. Generals who are self-seeking and interested in their reputation succumb to Athenians' prejudices and apply the aforementioned negative disposition and misconduct towards the allies of Athens. Isocrates notes that a general's behavioral pattern is fully aligned with the prejudices of the audience. In this case, prejudice as a prejudgment indicates a predetermined cognitive model of conduct towards the allies shared by the collective body of the Athenian citizens and aiming to arouse fear through threat and terror. Thus, this cognitive model of emotional disposition, response, and attitude to which the administrative authorities and Athenian citizens as legislature adhere is tagged as injurious for the city. Isocrates gradually builds on an emotional equilibrium between hatred and goodwill, which is fueled by fear or the lack of it. And this is number 13 in your handout. And I quote, "For he realized that men who are afraid hate those who inspire this feeling in them, and that it was due to the friendship of the other cities that Athens rose to great power and prosperity, just as it was due to their hatred that she barely escaped the most disastrous fate. Bearing in mind this fact, he used the power of Athens in order to subdue her enemies and the force of his own character in order to win the goodwill of the rest of the world, believing that this is the greater and nobler kind of generalship that to conquer many cities many times in battle. Unquote. Now, however simplistic or paradoxical this model may seem, it resonates with members of the Athenian civic body as it recalls the abusive maltreatment of the allies of Athens. Isocrates' argument is based on their past and recent experiences, along with positive consequences and negative repercussions. Although he seems to refer to other states, he alludes to Athens by employing the discourse of prominence, oppression, fear, and hegemony. In that sense, it may strike a chord with Athenian citizens as it implies the danger, almost disaster brought upon Athens due to abuse of its allies. Isocrates' model chimes with his manipulation of mythical narrative and historical experience, whether past or recent, as components of the shared identity constructed by the citizens through political and civic discourse. For example, this is number 14 in your handout. For if the foremost states resolve to abstain from acts of oppression, we shall have the credit for this blessing. But if, on the other hand, they attempt to oppress others, then all who fear them and suffer evil at their hands will come to us for refuge with many prayers and supplications, offering us not only the hegemony, but also their support. Civic fear appeals, to conclude, tend to focus on objects of fears that are unrecognized and underappreciated. Both Isocrates and Demosthenes make ample use of fear and address their audience with fear appeals. Their use acknowledges the value of this powerful emotion, which is to be taken into consideration in deliberative discourse and decision-making. Demosthenes, on the one hand, is more vehement and puts the object of fear directly in proximity, following the Aristotelian theory. The background of his fear appeals is the Metus hostilis felt by the Athenians and other Greek cities against Philip. In order for a fear appeal to be effective, it requires danger to be presented as imminent and pressing, as Aristotle showed us. However, to prompt the citizens to be involved in the action, the orator presents the object of fear as moderately manageable only if all proper action is undertaken. Now, on the other end of the spectrum stands Isocrates, who is a different case. Being well versed in the traditions of Athenian civic imaginary, the patriotic rhetoric in funeral and festival speeches, he draws on recent history and the Athenian mythical and distant past, thus making extensive use of the contrast between them. The object of fear, he prefers, looms in the Athenian past and is manifested also recently as Athens' unfair maltreatment of its allies. He suggests that only if the Athenians treat their allies with generosity and respect, this will win them the goodwill of the Greeks and the Panhellenic leadership, the hegemony. Greek cities exercising acts of oppression will induce fear to others, which will eventually turn to Athens. The key to understand his suggestion is to interpret it against the larger historical background of the tumultuous 5th and 4th century BCE, which brought Athens to its knees twice. Through the discourse of oppression and injustice, he alludes to Athenian imperialism and he reminds to Athenians how to fear their old self. So, thank you very much, and I would like to have your questions.
Thank you, Maria. That was wonderful. I'm ready to moderate. Who's got a question? I don't see that any have come in yet from from YouTube. So, Aileen, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question going back to the Olympian war, okay, so the Olympians certainly were not prepared and not ready to fight against Philip. But what about the Athenians? I think that the Athenians were asked to help and that they sent an army troop, but too late.
Yes.
And so what about the Athenians? Were they, did they deliberate for too long? Or was it a problem of people being bribed? Or was the fear too distant for them? And maybe in that case, maybe it would have been better to act really fast without deliberating. What do you think?
Thank you, and thank you very much for this very insightful question. You're absolutely right. What I liked in your question is that you really separated all these different parameters, which in a way Demosthenes alludes. For example, you said that the right course of action was for the Athenians to act fast and instantly. On the other hand, they were reluctant, and as you rightly pointed out, they sent a corps, but it arrived too late. On the other hand, the Olympians, as you also mentioned, sent and asked for help. So I think that this matter is complicated in what sense? I think that the Athenians didn't want to confront Philip, or at least they didn't feel ready to confront Philip. On the other hand, they had to support the Olympians because it was their closest allies in the region, as you also pointed out. So I think the fact that Demosthenes had to compose and to deliver 3, not only 1, but 3 orations, 3 deliberative orations, I think is very poignant and points towards the fact that Athenians didn't feel ready to take action. But at the end, they realized that they had to, because they wanted in a way, if not to stop Philip, but at least to try to curb his power. So an attempt should have been made. I don't know whether I answered your question.
Yes, you did, Maria. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation.
And may I also add that the Olympians, and just to add to Helene's very, very useful question, because it allows us to understand all the stakes that were involved in this really unique situation. The Olympians were not directly related to the Athenians. Why? Because the Olympians were not of Athenian origin. Let me remind you that the Athenians sent clerics to Potidea. So their closest ally, the ally which was related to them, was Potidea, not Olynthus. Okay, but for me, if I were an Athenian, I would be reluctant to confront Philip, but on the other hand, I would realize that I had to do it, because if I wouldn't do that now, then the next thing to come was either Potidea or another Klerouchi or another point in northern Greece or in Macedonia that was really part of the Athenian interests. So thank you
Yes.
very much.
Yeah, quite right.
Yeah, Bill, go ahead there.
Thank you for this very educational presentation. Made me think a lot about political rhetoric than I had before, and some structure in doing so. So, of course, my perspective is mostly from Greek mythology. So when you say Phobos, the first thing I think of is Deimos, the moons of Mars. Traditionally translated as fear and terror. But here in the Cosmos Society, we had a group do a great study on the word Deinos. And mentally, Deinos is more complex than just fear. But is Deinos used in this sort of rhetorical arguments in lieu of Phobos?
Usually, in rhetorical discourse and in fear appeals, Isocrates and Demosthenes, I haven't looked in other orators, but I'm happy to do that in while my research unfolds. They try to use all the cognate words regarding Phobos. However, I'm not excluding the possibility of Deinos, but I think that Deinos, in terms of lexical register, belongs, as you rightly pointed out, to the epic, and because it is a more it is a more complicated and more complex concept, or at least this is what it illustrates. By fear, Phobos, usually the orators point out to this feeling, this emotion that I tried to analyze, that I fear something. Something is at stake. My welfare is at stake. My well-being is at stake. I am in danger. Having read the Iliad, as you said, I think Denos is something far more complex than just feeling that someone is in danger.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's very good. It makes sense in oration. You want to get directly to the point. So yeah,
yes.
Good thought. Thanks.
I read the Philippics after the Olynthians, essentially telling the Athenians that Olynthus should be a cautionary tale for them. Philip was doing the same thing in Athens that he had done in Olynthus, which is basically to buy off some people in the city, and then the power to resist him was diminished, and he destroyed the city. And Demosthenes saw the same train coming at Athens, and history proved Demosthenes correct, I think.
I think that, yes, I think that for Demosthenes, if we are to interpret Demosthenes' way of thinking, he uses Olynthus as a blueprint of what is about to come if the Athenians don't deal with Philip as an imminent threat. I think this is something that I already mentioned in my presentation. But let us not forget that Demosthenes is trying also to steer STWR, but also to steer the feelings of fear that Athenians have towards Philip in order to prompt them into action. It is true that Philip, yes, used his power. He wanted Olynthos and he wanted Potidea because he wanted to expand towards the sea. Yes, in a way, you're right, Jack. I think that Demosthenes was eventually justified.
Sarah, can I see that you had a question?
Yes, hello, Maria, thank you. I'm not at all familiar really with Aristotle or with rhetoric, so this was very interesting for me, pretty much an introduction to that sort of field, and with those practical applications, the speeches that you concentrated on. So I have a perhaps rather more basic question. Aristotle has written about rhetoric, and to what extent were orators, like the examples you gave and other orators, to what extent did they draw on Aristotle's analysis, or was he describing what the orators themselves were doing?
I think it was the second case. What is good about Aristotle, especially when we read his works, and especially rhetoric, his works intersect with other disciplines and also with other fields. For example, as you rightly said, it's not just rhetoric that Aristotle discusses. For example, he discusses psychology of people, psychology of the individual, because this is what fear appeals is all about. The manipulation of the psychology of the people in order for someone to be convincing. And we all know how fear appeals, for example, especially in modern politics, how fear appeals also work nowadays. So if one studies Aristotle's rhetoric, he doesn't study how to deliver an oration, but also we study the content. For example, what is effective speaking? How we can convince someone? What kind of emotion should we present? So it intersects with things that we think that they are very modern, like, for example, emotional intelligence. It's a very modern word. However, Aristotle knew about this, and of course Isocrates, because Isocrates, for me, was not an orator like Demosthenes. He was more like a teacher of rhetoric and a philosopher. He called himself a philosopher. Okay, so Aristotle studied all these orators because we all know that he had a library, and having studied rhetoric himself, he wanted to present all this in a vademecum, in a book that all his pupils or his students could study and benefit from it. So rhetoric is not just rhetoric. Rhetoric is psychology, rhetoric is sociology, is anthropology, is politics. So it's more than just rhetoric. I hope I made that clear, and also I hope I showed why it is fascinating to study Aristotle's rhetoric.
Yes, yes, no, that was very interesting, and thank you for the further clarification. I think I'd assumed it was just about
Thank you for the
the
question.
beauty of language, and it's opened a whole different aspect for me. So thank you very much.
And it is exactly what you pointed out. It's the beauty of language. If one studies Aristotle, you will realize that his Greek are not the Greek of Plato. It is as if you're watching someone talking to you in everyday speech. It is a plain speech. It is a simple speech in simple Greek. It's not something complicated. So you will see that, you will realize that Aristotle is just sitting beside you, and he is trying to make you understand why it is useful for everyone to study rhetoric.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Masha, I see your hand up there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maria, so much for this presentation, and especially your analysis of the differences between the two orators, the two contemporaries. And my very brief question is related to that. And it has to do with what you mentioned, and I think it's passage number 3, where Isocrates refers to other orators and sort of dismisses them. Those who stir up fear in their audience or feel it on their behalf. Do you think he might have been, and to what extent obviously or just implicitly, referring to Demosthenes there? Because that's at least the sense I get from Demosthenes. I'm curious to know what you think. That he's
I don't think it was only, Isocrates, as far as I have studied his corpus or his speeches, he deflects, or he doesn't want, to target any opponents, like, for example, Demosthenes, with Aeschines, for example. It is not that type of person, and he does that, and he doesn't do that. There is one practical reason for not doing this, because most of his speeches were not delivered orally, but circulated as pamphlets among his students and his pupils. So he just wants to make his students more aware of how they should interpret other orators. So I would eschew from saying that, okay, he's referring particularly on Demosthenes, because I'm sure that there were other orators apart from Demosthenes who were against Philip. It was not just Demosthenes. It was Demosthenes was, let's say, the orator who was prominent and whose works we have and survived and were transmitted and survived through antiquity and posterity, and now we have them. But I'm sure that there were other politicians who acted as orators and also spoke against Philip. And especially the fact that, as I told you, Isocrates' speeches circulated as pamphlets. So I don't think that he would like to target this. He wants to make his students cautious. What we now call, in modern terms, discourse analysis, for example, because this is what Aristotle and Isocrates offer us. Examples of if they are so aware of discourse analysis, I think they are the people who literally invented this this notion. Like, watch out what they are telling you. This is my view. But I'm glad to hear other arguments and your thoughts.
Just wondering, and not in the sense of so in a vicious way referring to Demosthenes, but whether in his opinion Demosthenes would belong to that class of
yes,
art.
absolutely. Yes, you are right. Yes,
because
yes.
he himself, as you pointed out in the examples that you chose, really highlight this difference. Isocrates is, as you mentioned, he said, called himself philosopher. he's much more rationalizing and analytical about it, whereas Demosthenes seems to really be stirring up.
You're absolutely right. But one thing that I would like to point out is that he does it in the most subtle way, because he is not confrontational. Isocrates is not a confrontational orator. The only oration that wrote about himself is the antidosis oration. And he obviously delivered it in court. So yes, of course, I agree with with what you wonderfully pointed out. That probably, yes, I think that he includes Demosthenes in this political group, but let's say that he doesn't want to become too confrontational.
Thank you so much. I think you're absolutely right. For what it's worth.
Because let us not forget that he's a teacher. I mean, Isocrates is not an active orator like Demosthenes. It's not an action man.
Perhaps one more question. Our hour is about up. Yeah, Georgia. Oh, you're muted, Georgia. Hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry. Now it's better. Yeah, sorry.
Yes,
So thank you very much, Maria. It was wonderful. I was just, because you mentioned it, and it was not. It's not easy to ignore, let's say, the parallel lines between ancient politics and rhetoric writings and today politics, the populist line. Now, even Cicero later on, and certainly the ancient Greek writers contemplating on the issue, were actually considering the fact of evoking fear in your writings or in your speeches as a positive persuasive tool. And especially, Cicero, if you do it for a good purpose, this rational manipulation of emotions for a good purpose, I don't think is demonized in this sense. So my first question is, where do you draw the line between this kind of emotional, to a certain extent, manipulation and today's populism? Is it the absence, let's say, the absent perspective of a common good purpose, of a collective good purpose? Is this about having the bigger picture, or not having it, I'm sorry, and B? And I think that very important here is, for my understanding, apart from the obvious effect that these pictures have, at the same time, fear is deflated from its negative connotation in ancient Greece in the sense that is actually commonly admitted as a fact. When Thucydides puts his Athenian ambassadors talking about the imperialism of Athens, saying it was theos time ophelia, fear, honor, and profit interest that made us go after, this bigger picture. There's certainly not a regret or not a second thought about the, let's say, humble dimension of fear. Remembering Plato's the other side, courage is knowing what not to fear. So I think there is a certain differentiation which is perhaps of importance. But thank you very much.
Yeah. So if I interpret your very useful comments, I think that what I would, where I would draw a line, I think when there is a discrepancy, for example, we all know that there is fear-mongering in modern politics, a lot of fear-mongering. And however, there is a discrepancy between people's expectations and also what people in politics want to achieve. In ancient Greece, and what I think, what Isocrates, for example, and I would expect you to comment on that. I think what Isocrates subtly does, and I think it's quite populistic in a sense, in when he evokes the Athenian past in order to convince Athens that, you know, we were great, and if we do that to our allies, then they will hand us over the hegemony willingly, which of course sounds very naive. That's why, for example, Jacqueline de Romilly called Isocrates a naive politician or political commentator. Whereas Demosthenes, on the other hand, might sound very fear-mongering, but as Jack said, ultimately, history proved that in a way was right, because Philip was coming was after Athens, after all. Please remind me again, I missed some of your points which I would like to answer. Could you, I don't know whether this answers your question, because your question had many useful points that I would like to address. So could you also remind me of other points that...
No, I think the line between, I mean, what I was trying to presuppose, if you don't have, you know, as a orator or as a speaker or as a politician, if you don't have a petty personal interest or a petty micro interest, it doesn't have to be, it's about you, your peers, your group, your next of kin, then it becomes, of course, it has another gravity as a populist idea.
Absolutely, yes.
And this is, I think, a line which is obviously there because there was the Athenian community was important. Let's say the survival of the Athenians was still important, you know, for the speakers. So this is something one has to have in mind. And at the same time, the Athenians themselves and the ancient Greeks were very aware of these emotions and of the, let's say, of the positive dimensions of these emotions for their well-being. Even, you know, and not only the Greeks, I mean, the Romans as well later on, you know, that's just in a way you evoke fear in order to boost your moral energy. This metus hostium, the fear of the enemy, in order to be able to stand your ground. So it has this parallel dimensions which are very important. But you know, it's just because as we are, I think, as lovers of the ancient world, it's not that we embellish or we romanticize, but there are things that connect. There we find appealing, and we try to connect, and we find ourselves connected. And I think there is some self-reflecting moments in Thucydides, above all. I guess this is where he, where in a way, the sheer way of having the Athenians talking about the imperialist practices and naming these three reasons. Yeah, in a way, it's so sobering that they are becoming, in a way, let's say, not closer. It's not that, you know, you cannot really like the Athenians from this point of view, but it's sobering in a self-reflecting way.
You are absolutely right. I think your comment, you know, gives way to some very fundamental issues about what you rightly said, that Thucydides is the most self-reflective response that we may have about Athenian hegemony and Athenian politics. Let us not forget that during the the Peloponnesian War, what we called radical democracy was implemented in the midst of this war. I mean, the democracy was still evolving even during the Peloponnesian War. I agree with you when you said that, yes, fear, this metus hostile, the other comment you just made about standing your ground, because I borrowed, as you rightly said, from this phrase from Cicero and from his and also what Romans felt about Carthage and so on. It is true, but I think, don't you think that with Romans we enter fear, acquire some different political characteristics than ancient Greece? I'm not saying that the Roman characteristics of fear and the Greek characteristics of fear are related to the modern characteristics of fear in terms of how people fear, how individuals fear nowadays. But I think there are, in a way, different between them.
I think what changes in the Roman world is that then you have more the Homeric demos in the sense of terror, because then the emperors obviously were exercising terror so they can have, let's say, the people at their feet. But this doesn't mean, when you said about Carthage, it is in a way the famous delenda est, Carthago delenda est, was actually had to be destroyed, but it was by at the same time there were parties and there were groups who were saying no, it has to exist so we can be reminded what we have to fight for or what we have to stand for.
I fully agree. In what sense? If you read Evrygenes' book, you will realize that this is the fundamental argument of his political theory. What Evrygenes is saying is that in a way fear was where Rome was built on, or helped Rome develop and expand, whereas Athens was a different case. But still, I think that all these comments that you offered are really very useful in order to contextualize the different versions of fear. I don't know whether my response is fitted to your question. But thank you for the excellent, this was very useful, very useful. Thank you.
Maria, thank you for joining us.
Every situation is different, and sometimes the eunoia is the right way to go to avoid unnecessary wars, and sometimes you just, there's no other way but to fight. So in Philip's case, do you think Isocrates was co-opted, or was he right?
Well, this is a very big issue to discuss, and because we don't have time. Well, let's say that if there was, I think that Demosthenes was right, because as you rightly pointed out, Demosthenes wanted to expand his power. So Aeschines was using an appeasement policy. Of course, somebody could argue against it. Well, this is my briefest answer that you could get, because we don't have time, and Keith is. I don't want to press Keith.
Yes, maybe we can continue this beautiful conversation offline. Maria, I'd just like to thank you again for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you to our community, to our members, both who are present and online. And I hope to see all of you again in our next CHS Open House.